A hedgerow outside St. Lo splits the morning haze, late July 1944. A private from the 29th Infantry Division of the American Army presses himself into the wet dirt at the base of the bocage, close enough to taste the mud. Somewhere on the other side of the hedge, a sound starts that he has never heard before and will never forget. Not the steady, almost lazy chatter of an American Browning, but something closer to canvas being torn in half, over and over, faster than his ear can separate into individual shots. He counts to 3 and gives up counting. Later, he will tell the men behind him that it doesn't sound like gunfire at all. It sounds like a machine that hates you personally, and for the next several minutes, nobody in that field moves. That sound belongs to a machine gun the Wehrmacht designated the MG-42. And it belongs to a weapon so plain-looking, stamped sheet metal, no polish, no elegance, edges left rough where a machined weapon would have been finished smooth, that the first Americans to examine a captured one assumed it was some kind of crude, improvised fallback design. It was not a fallback. It was gun for gun, the single most lethal portable weapon that George Patton's soldiers faced anywhere on the Western Front, and almost nothing the American Army carried into 1944 could match its raw output of fire. It was never meant to look impressive. It was meant to kill more efficiently, more cheaply, and more reliably than any machine gun that came before it. And on all 3 counts, it succeeded better than its own designers had any right to expect. Go back to the First World War and the shape of the problem becomes obvious. The German army of that era relied heavily on the water-cooled MG-08, a weapon of tremendous sustained output but enormous weight, essentially bolted to a fixed position and useless for infantry trying to move and fight at the same time. The Treaty of Versailles then stripped Germany's post-war army down to a token force and placed strict limits on the heavy weapons it was allowed to keep, which forced a generation of German ordnance officers to think hard and mostly in secret about what a machine gun for the next war would need to do differently. The interwar Reichswehr drew the lesson that a modern army needed one weapon capable of doing both jobs at once, light and mobile enough for an infantry squad to carry forward on the attack, but steady and sustained enough on a tripod to anchor a defensive line for hours. That doctrine produced the MG-34 in the 1930s, and on paper it was exactly the weapon German planners wanted: accurate, well-balanced, genuinely dual purpose. The problem wasn't the MG-34's performance on the battlefield. It was everything standing behind it in the factory. The MG-34 was built almost entirely through precision machining, its receiver and internal components individually milled to tight tolerances that demanded skilled labor, expensive tooling, and long production hours at every single stage. It was also notoriously sensitive to dirt, sand, and mud, exactly the conditions German infantry would spend years fighting in, from the deserts outside Tobruk to the frozen mud of the Eastern Front. As German war production tried to scale up through 1940 and 1941, ordnance planners ran into a hard piece of arithmetic. They needed several times more machine guns than German industry could realistically machine by hand, built by a skilled labor pool that kept shrinking as men were pulled into uniform, and they needed a weapon that kept firing when it was caked in filth instead of jamming on the first grain of sand. A gun that performed brilliantly but couldn't be built fast enough was, from an army's perspective, barely better than no gun at all. The answer came from an engineer named Werner Gruner, working through the firm Metall- und Lackierwarenfabrik Johannes Großfuß in the Saxon town of Döbeln, a company with a background in stamped metal consumer goods and lacquered housewares, not weapons. That background turned out to matter enormously. Gruner's team reimagined the machine gun almost entirely around sheet metal stamping and pressing rather than machining, a manufacturing philosophy borrowed more from the automotive and appliance industries than from any traditional small arms workshop. A stamped steel receiver could be pressed out by semi-skilled factory labor in a fraction of the machine hours a milled MG-34 receiver required. And that single shift in method meant Germany could suddenly produce machine guns at a scale its own planners hadn't thought possible only a few years earlier. Production is reported to have eventually reached several 100,000 units over the course of the war, a volume the MG-34's production lines never came close to matching. Speed of manufacture solved only half the problem, though. The other half was solving what happens to a machine gun once it's actually firing continuously in combat. The locking system Gruner's team settled on was a roller-locked, short recoil action. Barrel and bolt travel backward together for a short distance, then angled cam surfaces drive two steel rollers inward, unlocking the bolt from the barrel extension so it can cycle on its own before the barrel returns to battery. The underlying roller locking concept has a genuinely debated lineage. Some historians trace its earliest roots to an experimental Polish rifle design from the 1930s, credited to engineer Edward Steck, which German designers are believed to have reworked into a practical roller system. What Mauser's development work and Großfuß's engineering team actually delivered either way was something new, a fully locked breech mechanism robust enough to handle a full power rifle cartridge cycling at a punishing rate, years before anyone adapted that same roller principle into the very different systems that followed it. Layered onto that mechanism was a barrel quick change system that let a trained two-man crew swap an overheating barrel in as little as 5 seconds by period accounts, solving the single biggest limiting factor on any machine gun's sustained rate of fire, which is heat buildup melting or warping a barrel under prolonged use. Belt-fed rather than drum-fed, the weapon could also be reloaded faster under fire than the MG-34's saddle drum system allowed, keeping a crew's fire going through exactly the moments an attacking force most needed a gap to open up. Paired with the roughly 20-kilogram Lafette 42 tripod, the same weapon gained a built-in traversing and elevating mechanism, the Tiefenfeuer automat that let a crew walk indirect, plunging fire across a predefined beaten zone using a telescopic sight, reportedly out to ranges of 3,000 meters or more, hitting targets the gun team couldn't even see directly. The result, adopted into German service in 1942 as the MG-42, weighed in at a little over 11.5 kilograms unloaded and cycled at roughly 1,200 rounds per minute in its standard configuration, with lighter bolt variants documented running closer to 1,500, nearly double the cyclic rate of the gun it replaced, and roughly twice the rate of the standard machine guns carried by most Allied infantry squads on the very same battlefields, depending on exactly which weapon you set it against. None of that speed or firepower meant anything without trained hands behind it, and German instructors built an entire curriculum around producing MG-42 crews fast. A gunner and an assistant gunner drilled together as a fixed pair, the assistant responsible for feeding belts smoothly into the tray and slapping in a fresh barrel while the gunner kept his eyes on the field, and a well-drilled team could reportedly change a glowing hot barrel in well under 10 seconds without ever fully losing their arc of fire. That crew served discipline as much as the mechanism itself is what let a 2- or 3-man team punch so far above its numbers once the shooting started. If you're enjoying this, a subscribe helps. Now back to the gun that earned a nickname nobody wanted to be on the receiving end of. American troops first ran into the weapon's predecessor and its doctrine well before Normandy. In February 1943, German and Italian forces mauled inexperienced American Second Corps units at the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. And it was in the aftermath of that defeat that George Patton himself took command of Second Corps and set about rebuilding its discipline under fire. Fire that, within weeks, increasingly came from early production MG-42s alongside the older MG-34. It was an early, hard lesson in exactly what his men would keep facing for the next 2 years. American and British troops encountered the weapon in growing numbers through Sicily later that year, but it was Normandy, starting in June 1944, that burned it permanently into Allied memory. Defending prepared positions in hedgerow country, a single well-sighted MG-42 crew could saturate an entire field of approach with fire faster than attacking infantry could physically cross it. And the distinctive ripping sound of its cyclic rate, too fast for a human ear to separate into individual shots, became something soldiers learned to recognize before they ever laid eyes on the gun itself. American soldiers took to calling it Hitler's Buzzsaw, a nickname that spread through unit slang long before formal intelligence bulletins caught up with the threat. The War Department eventually produced training material specifically to familiarize new arrivals with the sound, on the theory that a soldier who froze trying to identify an unfamiliar noise was a soldier about to become a casualty. When Patton's Third Army broke out across France that August, driving hard through the Falaise pocket and then east across the Seine toward Lorraine, MG-42 crews were a constant feature of the rearguard actions German commanders leaned on to buy time for a retreating force. A single team, sometimes just 2 or 3 men with one gun, a tripod, and a stack of ammunition belts, could hold a crossroads or a single farmhouse against a force many times its size, simply by putting out more sustained fire per second than the attackers could return before flanking maneuvers or artillery could dislodge them. That pattern repeated through the autumn fighting around Metz and across the grinding hedgerow and forest terrain of the Lorraine campaign, where American Army after-action reports flagged MG-42 nests as the single most common obstacle slowing infantry advances through open ground. It repeated again that December and January when German units used the weapon to brutal effect during the opening days of the Ardennes offensive, cutting down American units caught in the open around positions like Elsenborn Ridge before the line finally stiffened. In nearly every one of these engagements, the story rhymed. German casualties from Allied artillery and air power were often severe once positions were located, but for the minutes an MG-42 crew stayed in action undetected, they inflicted casualties on advancing infantry wildly out of proportion to their own numbers. Set the MG-42 next to what Patton's infantry actually carried into those same fields, and the gap becomes stark, and it goes beyond just the rate of fire. The standard American squad and vehicle machine gun, the M1919 Browning, fired at somewhere around 400 to 600 rounds per minute depending on the variant, a steady, controllable rate built around aimed, sustained fire rather than raw volume. And American infantry doctrine built its entire squad tactics around a base of well-aimed rifle fire supported by that Browning, not the other way around. German doctrine inverted that relationship entirely. The machine gun was the squad's primary weapon, and every rifleman existed chiefly to feed it ammunition, protect its flanks, and let it do the killing. The British Army's Bren gun ran slower still, closer to 500 rounds per minute, prized for accuracy and reliability over sheer output, fitting a similarly rifle-centric doctrine. Soviet forces on the Eastern Front fielded the drum-fed DP-27, with a comparable rate to the Bren and a reputation for jamming at exactly the wrong moment. None of them came close to the MG-42's cyclic rate, and none of them could be rebarreled and brought back into sustained action as quickly under fire. What the Allies had going for them was different in kind rather than degree. Far greater total numbers of machine guns and riflemen to spread the losses across. Logistics that kept ammunition and replacement crews flowing even after heavy fighting. And increasingly as 1944 wore on, air superiority that could often find and neutralize a fixed machine gun position before infantry ever had to walk into its arc at all. Gun for gun, in a direct exchange of fire, the MG-42 usually won. It could not on its own win a war that Germany was already losing on every other front, and Allied commanders came to understand that distinction well before the war ended. Waite told a similar story from a different angle. At a little over 11.5 kilograms, the MG-42 was noticeably lighter than the roughly 14-kilogram Browning it faced, meaning a retreating German crew could displace a gun to a new position faster than an American squad could relocate its own heavier weapon. A tactical edge that mattered enormously in the fluid, hedgerow-to-hedgerow fighting of that summer. A related mix-up shows up constantly in period letters and even some post-war histories. Allied troops often called any German machine gun a Spandau, a holdover nickname from the water-cooled MG-08 of the First World War, which really was partly produced at the Spandau Arsenal in Berlin. The MG-42 had no meaningful connection to that factory or that older gun beyond both being German-made, but the label stuck out of habit, and it still occasionally gets repeated today as though it were the weapon's real name. A more persistent myth about the MG-42 is that its terrifying rate of fire meant German gunners simply held the trigger down and let it spray, a weapon built for panic rather than precision. German infantry doctrine taught closer to the opposite. Gunners were drilled to fire in short, controlled bursts of roughly 4 to 6 rounds, both to conserve an ammunition supply that a sustained burst would burn through in seconds, and to keep the weapon's punishing recoil from walking fire off target entirely. The dread the gun produced wasn't a side effect of wasteful random spraying. It was the product of disciplined, repeated, short bursts landing exactly where a trained crew intended them to land, which is a considerably more unsettling thing to face than indiscriminate fire would have been, and a detail most popular retellings of the weapon leave out entirely in favor of the simpler, scarier story. What happened to the design after 1945 says as much about its engineering as anything that happened on a battlefield. Rather than disappearing with the regime that built it, Gruner's roller locked, short recoil mechanism was carried forward almost unchanged into West Germany's post-war Bundeswehr as the MG3, rechambered for standard NATO ammunition. And that weapon, along with licensed and near-identical derivatives built in Italy, Spain, Pakistan, and Iran, remained in frontline service with multiple armies for decades afterward, with some variants reportedly still turning up in conflicts today. Late in the war, separately, Mauser engineers took the underlying roller principle in a different direction, adapting it into a lighter, simplified, roller-delayed blowback system for an experimental rifle. That second lineage survived the collapse of Germany through engineers who kept working on it first in France and then in Spain, and resurfaced post-war as the Spanish Set-Me rifle, and, by 1959, the Bundeswehr's own G3, with a scaled-down version eventually powering Heckler and Koch's MP5 submachine gun. It's a genuinely different operating system from the MG42's own locked breech action. Not the same mechanism in a new housing, but the same core roller concept sits at the root of both family trees. Surviving wartime MG42s and their post-war descendants now sit in military museums from Koblenz to Fort Benning, studied less as battlefield relics than as a genuine turning point in machine gun design. Not a precision instrument built for the few, but an inexpensive, mass-producible tool that any trained two-man crew could learn to operate to devastating effect. A philosophy nearly every general-purpose machine gun built since has borrowed from in one form or another. Even the sound itself outlived the war, showing up decades later in war films, documentaries, and video games, specifically because sound designers know audiences still register that distinctive tearing cloth ripple as a signal of real danger, whether or not they could ever name the weapon making it. Few small arms from any conflict have had their acoustic signature become as instantly recognizable as this one, stamped sheet metal and all. Back at that hedgerow outside St. Lo, the sound eventually stops, and the men on the American side start moving again, more carefully now, listening for it before they trust the silence. They will hear that same tearing cloth ripple many more times before the war in Europe ends, in the Ardennes that winter, in the Rhineland the following spring, wherever a handful of German defenders needed to make a much larger attacking force pay in blood for every field and every farmhouse. What Werner Gruner and a stamped metal factory in Döbeln built was not beautiful, and it was never meant to be. It was meant to be cheap, fast to manufacture, and merciless in the hands of two men and a tripod. And against nearly everything Patton's army carried into those fields, it did exactly what it was built to do. Extraordinary machines. A cause that deserved to lose. That contradiction is the whole story.